London, 1845. Victoria Dunham stared at her reflection in the dressing-table mirror, barely recognizing the woman who gazed back. The past 4 years had transformed her from a carefree debutante into something altogether different, a widow at 26, bearing the invisible brand of scandal that London society never quite allowed one to forget. "Miss Victoria, we must hurry if we're to arrive at a respectable hour," her lady's maid, Agnes, reminded her as she secured the final pin in Victoria's dark chestnut hair. Victoria nodded, rising from her seat. Her gown of midnight blue silk whispered against the floor, modest yet elegant, neither drawing attention nor suggesting she had surrendered completely to spinsterhood. She had selected it with calculated precision. Tonight was merely an obligation, a favor to her cousin Elena, who had begged her attendance at the Pembroke summer ball to deflect attention from her own impending engagement. "No one will notice me," Victoria had promised her cousin earlier that week. "I am practically invisible these days." And that was precisely how she preferred it. Invisibility meant safety. Invisibility meant no whispers, no stares, no reminders of the disastrous marriage that had nearly ruined her. As Agnes draped a shawl around her shoulders, Victoria steeled herself with the mantra that had sustained her through these years of careful retreat. True safety comes only from independence. Love is a luxury afforded to the innocent, not the disgraced. The carriage journey to Pembroke House passed in contemplative silence. Victoria watched London's gaslit streets slide past, each fashionable townhouse representing a drawing room where, at one time or another, her name had been whispered with varying degrees of pity or condemnation. A fortune hunter's prey, they had called her when she wed Thomas Dunham at 19. Poor naive creature, they murmured when his gambling debts mounted. Disgraced widow, they whispered when he died in a duel over unpaid debts, leaving her nearly penniless and thoroughly scandalized. What they never saw was how she had rebuilt her life, carefully investing the modest inheritance from her aunt, creating a quiet independence that required no one's approval or protection. Victoria had made her peace with spinsterhood. It was the price of freedom. The carriage slowed as it joined the queue approaching Pembroke House, an imposing Portland stone mansion whose windows blazed with light. Victoria felt the familiar constriction in her chest, the tightness that preceded every social engagement she could not avoid. "Lady Victoria Dunham," announced the footman at the entrance to the ballroom. Few heads turned. Victoria had expected nothing different. After 4 seasons of selective appearances, she had mastered the art of polite invisibility. She moved with practiced grace toward the less populated side of the ballroom, where Elena had promised to meet her. "You came," Elena exclaimed, rushing toward her with unconcealed relief. At 20, Elena possessed the vibrant beauty Victoria remembered once having herself. "I feared you might change your mind." "I promised, did I not?" Victoria smiled, gently squeezing her cousin's hands. "Now, where is this besotted suitor I'm meant to assess?" Elena's face brightened. "Lord Thistlewick is speaking with Papa near the refreshment table, but first," she lowered her voice, leaning closer, "I should warn you. There's a new arrival, causing quite a stir." Victoria's smile never faltered, though her interest immediately waned. Society's infatuations with new faces was a predictable affair. "I'm certain they're very impressive. He's just returned from abroad. America, I believe. Henry Pembrooke, the younger son who was thought quite lost to respectable society. Apparently, he's made a fortune in shipping and returned to reconcile with the Duke." Victoria froze. "Pembroke, we're standing in his family home." "Yes, his brother is the Duke of Westmoreland. Hadn't you realized?" Elena looked puzzled. "It's all anyone can speak of. The prodigal son returns, handsomer and wealthier than anyone anticipated." Victoria felt a sudden urgency to retreat. The Pembrokes were old money, influential, powerful. She had successfully avoided such prominent circles precisely because they represented the greatest threat to her carefully constructed peace. Perhaps I should. But Elena had already gasped, her eyes fixed on something over Victoria's shoulder. There he is, she whispered, her voice filled with the awe young women reserve for handsome men of fortune. Mr. Pembroke himself. Against her better judgment, Victoria turned. The orchestra had just begun a new set, and dancers were taking their positions. Through the shifting crowd, across the vast expanse of the ballroom, stood a man whose very posture seemed to reject the rigid formality around him. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that appeared slightly too long by London standards. He wore evening attire with the casual confidence of someone who had forgotten its constraints. Victoria couldn't make out his features clearly at this distance, yet something about him commanded attention. Not the practiced, mannered attention sought by society gentlemen, but something magnetic, almost primal. They say he built his fortune from nothing, Elena continued, her voice hushed with scandalized admiration. That he sailed as a common merchant before acquiring his own ships. Imagine a duke's son living as a common sailor. Victoria was about to comment that such rumors were invariably exaggerated when the crowd between them parted momentarily, and Henry Pembroke looked directly at her. The ballroom seemed to still. Victoria felt the air leave her lungs as his gaze caught hers across the room, direct, unflinching, devoid of the polite pretense that governed every interaction in these gilded halls. She couldn't look away, even as she felt heat rising to her cheeks. She had forgotten this feeling, this disorienting awareness of being truly seen. Then the moment broke as quickly as it had begun. The crowd shifted again, blocking him from view. Victoria released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Oh my," Elena whispered, glancing between Victoria and the space where Henry Pembroke had stood. "I believe he noticed you." "Nonsense," Victoria replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "He was merely surveying the room. Come, introduce me to your Lord Thistlewick before I'm obliged to dance with someone's elderly uncle." As Elena led her through the crowd, Victoria refused to glance back. Whatever that moment had been, she would not indulge it. She had learned the hard way that moments of inexplicable connection were merely illusions that led sensible women down treacherous paths. Yet as the evening progressed, she found herself acutely aware of Henry Pembroke's movements through the ballroom. Though they never stood in close proximity, she sensed his presence like a change in atmospheric pressure. Twice more she caught him watching her, and twice more she deliberately turned away. "Lady Dunham," a voice interrupted her thoughts as she stood near the refreshment table. Lord Thistlewick, Elena's suitor, bowed before her. He seemed a sensible young man, if somewhat conventional. "Would you honor me with the next dance? Your cousin suggested you might be willing." Victoria hesitated, then smiled politely. "I would be delighted, my lord." As they took their places for the quadrille, Victoria noticed a stir near the entrance to the ballroom. Henry Pembroke had positioned himself among the dancers, partnered with a young debutante who looked positively giddy at her good fortune. The music began, and Victoria focused on her steps with mechanical precision. When the pattern of the dance brought her face to face with Pembroke, she kept her eyes carefully averted, but she felt his gaze like a physical touch. The figures of the dance separated them again, and Victoria exhaled with relief. But as the pattern repeated and they were once more brought together, Pembroke spoke, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You're working very hard to avoid looking at me, Lady Dunham." The directness of his observation startled her so completely that she did look up, meeting eyes the color of weathered steel, observant, intelligent, faintly amused. "I wasn't aware we had been introduced, sir," she replied coolly as they circled each other before the dance separated them again. When next they came together, he smiled, not the practiced society smile, but something genuine that reached his eyes. "We haven't been, hence my interest in remedying the situation." The dance moved them apart before she could respond. Victoria focused on her steps with renewed intensity, unsettled by the encounter. When they next came together, she was prepared. "Your reputation precedes you, Mr. Pembroke," she said quietly. "As I imagine mine does as well. Perhaps that explains your interest." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "I make it a point never to believe in reputations, Lady Dunham. I've found them uniformly unreliable." They separated once more, and as the dance concluded, Victoria curtsied to Lord Thistlewick with practiced grace. But her thoughts remained with the unexpected exchange. No one in her recent memory had addressed her with such frank disregard for social pretense. She made her way to the edge of the ballroom, seeking a moment's respite from the heat and noise. A small anteroom offered a temporary sanctuary, its doors open to catch the evening breeze. Victoria stepped inside, finding it blessedly empty, or so she thought. "You disappeared rather abruptly," came a voice from behind her. Victoria turned to find Henry Pembroke standing in the doorway. Close up, she could see the faint lines around his eyes, the slight weathering of his complexion that spoke of years spent outdoors, decidedly unaristocratic features that nonetheless enhanced rather than diminished his appearance. "Mr. Pembroke," she acknowledged, maintaining her composure despite her surprise. "I was merely seeking a moment of quiet." "Then we have that in common." He stepped into the room but remained at a respectful distance. "These affairs grow oppressive after years away from them." Victoria regarded him cautiously. "I imagine America offers different forms of society." "Less rigid, certainly, more direct." He smiled slightly. "One speaks one's mind without requiring 3 generations of acquaintance first." Despite herself, Victoria felt the corner of her mouth lift. How barbaric. Refreshingly so. He moved toward the window, creating space between them that she recognized as a deliberate courtesy. "Is that why you've been avoiding my gaze all evening, Lady Dunham? To maintain proper English reserve?" The directness of the question caught her off guard again. "I wasn't aware I owed you my attention, Mr. Pembroke." "You don't," he agreed easily. "Yet you've been conscious of my presence since the moment our eyes met across the ballroom, as I have been of yours." Victoria felt heat rise to her cheeks. No one in polite society spoke with such brazen honesty. It was both disconcerting and strangely exhilarating. "You presume a great deal on short acquaintance," she said carefully. "Another American failing, I'm told." His expression sobered slightly. "I've spent too many years facing storms at sea to waste time on social pretense, Lady Dunham. When something of interest catches my attention, I investigate directly." "And I am something of interest?" Victoria asked, unsure whether to be offended or intrigued. Henry Pembroke studied her for a long moment. "In a room full of people performing versions of themselves, you alone seem to be standing guard against the world. It makes one wonder what you're protecting." The observation struck too close to truth. Victoria felt suddenly exposed, vulnerable in a way she had carefully avoided for years. She straightened her posture, retreating behind the shield of formality. "I should rejoin my cousin," she said, moving toward the door. "She'll be wondering where I've gone." He didn't try to stop her, but as she passed, he spoke once more. "I'll be at Lady Harrington's garden party on Thursday. Perhaps we might continue our conversation there, with proper English reserve intact, of course." Victoria paused, torn between caution and an inexplicable reluctance to end their exchange. "I don't believe I'll be attending." "A pity," he said, and there was genuine regret in his voice. "Good evening, then, Lady Dunham." She left without looking back, her composure intact, but her thoughts in disarray. This encounter had been precisely the sort of complication she had spent years avoiding, a direct challenge to her carefully constructed defenses. As Victoria rejoined the festivities, she resolved to put Henry Pembroke from her mind. Men of his position and confidence were dangerous precisely because they made impossible things seem momentarily possible. She had learned that lesson at great cost and would not repeat the mistake. Yet that night, as her carriage rolled through London's darkened streets, Victoria found herself remembering not his handsome features or his forthright manner, but the unexpected perception in his gaze, as though he had seen not the scandal-tainted widow, not the carefully composed society figure, but something else entirely. Someone she had almost forgotten existed. 3 days later, Victoria sat in her modest but elegant drawing room on Portman Square, reviewing her household accounts with the careful attention that had preserved her independence. The modest income from her investments required vigilant management, but she had developed a gift for financial prudence that her younger self would never have imagined necessary. A knock at the door interrupted her calculations. Agnes entered, bearing a silver salver with a single envelope. "From Lady Harrington, miss," Agnes said, offering the tray. Victoria took the envelope with a puzzled frown. While she maintained cordial relations with most of society, close friendships were luxuries she had largely abandoned. Lady Harrington was an amiable acquaintance at best. The note inside was brief but pointed. "My dear Lady Dunham, I find myself in desperate need of sensible company at tomorrow's garden party. The event threatens to be overrun by giggling debutantes and their scheming mammas, all circling poor Mr. Pembroke like vultures around a particularly handsome carcass. Your presence would provide welcome relief to both myself and, I suspect, the gentleman in question. My carriage will collect you at 2 o'clock sharp. Yours in friendship, Augusta Harrington." Victoria set the note down slowly. Lady Harrington was well known for her direct manner and her dislike of matchmaking mothers. What was unexpected was her apparent alliance with Henry Pembrooke, and her assumption that Victoria would agree to attend. "Will there be a reply, miss?" Agnes asked. The prudent response would be a polite refusal. Victoria had no business inserting herself into the circus that would undoubtedly surround a wealthy, unmarried gentleman of good family. Moreover, she had already sensed the danger Henry Pembroke represented to her carefully ordered existence. Yet the memory of their brief exchange lingered. For a few moments in that anteroom, she had felt something long dormant stirring to life, the part of herself that had once delighted in forthright conversation, in the meeting of minds unencumbered by society's elaborate choreography. "Yes," Victoria said, reaching for her pen. "Please tell Lady Harrington's messenger that I would be delighted to accept her kind invitation." The following afternoon found Victoria seated beside Lady Harrington on a wrought iron bench in the dappled shade of an ancient oak tree. From this vantage point, they could observe the entire gathering while remaining somewhat removed from its center. "There," Lady Harrington murmured, nodding toward a cluster of brightly dressed young women. "The seventh circle of matrimonial hell." Victoria followed her gaze to where Henry Pembroke stood surrounded by a half-dozen debutantes and their watchful chaperons. He was responding with apparent good humor to their attentions, yet Victoria detected a certain tension in his posture. "He bears it remarkably well for a man who claims to dislike social pretense," Victoria observed. Lady Harrington chuckled. "Henry has always had impeccable manners when necessary. It's what made his departure so shocking 10 years ago. He knew precisely which rules he was breaking." She glanced sideways at Victoria. "But I suspect you understand something about that yourself." The comment, though not unkindly meant, reminded Victoria of her precarious position in society. "My circumstances were rather different, Lady Harrington." "Indeed," the older woman agreed. "You had no choice but to face the consequences, while Henry simply sailed away from his." She rose with surprising agility for a woman of her years. "I believe I shall rescue our mutual friend. Would you care to accompany me?" Before Victoria could protest that Henry Pembroke was certainly not her friend, Lady Harrington had already begun moving toward the group, leaving Victoria little choice but to follow or remain awkwardly alone. "Mr. Pembroke," Lady Harrington announced as they approached, "I simply must show you the new rose varieties I've imported from France. Lady Dunham has expressed particular interest as well." The look of relief that crossed Henry's face was almost comical. He extricated himself from his admirers with practiced ease. "Ladies, you must excuse me. Lady Harrington's roses are apparently not to be missed." As they moved away from the disappointed group, Henry leaned close to Lady Harrington. "Augusta, you are a saint among women." "Hardly that," she replied dryly, "though I expect proper gratitude for the rescue." She gestured vaguely toward a distant part of the garden. "The roses are that way. I'm sure you too can find them without my assistance. I suddenly recall urgent business with the refreshment table." Before either could respond, she had departed, leaving Victoria and Henry standing alone on the garden path. "I believe we've been rather neatly manipulated," Victoria said, after a moment of silence. Henry's mouth quirked into a smile. "Augusta hasn't changed a bit. She was orchestrating outcomes before I learned to tie my own cravat." He gestured toward the path ahead. "Shall we at least maintain the pretense of viewing the roses? It seems the least we can do to reward her efforts." They walked side by side down the gravel path, maintaining a proper distance, yet somehow more acutely aware of each other than the proximity warranted. "I confess I'm surprised to see you here," Henry said. "You seemed quite determined to avoid future encounters when last we spoke." Victoria kept her eyes on the path ahead. "Lady Harrington can be remarkably persuasive." "Is that the only reason?" he asked, his tone casual but his gaze direct when she glanced up. Victoria considered several responses, polite deflections, gentle rebuffs, but found herself unwilling to retreat behind social niceties. "No," she admitted, "I was curious." His smile deepened, revealing a dimple in his left cheek. "About the roses. About why a man who claims to despise social pretense would attend an event clearly designed for matchmaking." Henry laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "A fair question. The truth is painfully mundane, family obligation. My brother believes my continued presence at these affairs will help repair whatever damage my decade-long absence caused to the family name." "And you agree?" "I think my brother overestimates both the damage and society's long memory." He glanced at her. "Though perhaps some memories are more enduring than others." Victoria tensed, sensing the conversation approaching dangerous territory. "London society never truly forgets, Mr. Pembroke. It merely finds new scandals to occupy its attention." They had reached the rose garden, a carefully arranged collection of bushes in full summer bloom. Henry stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "Is that why you maintain such careful distance from everyone around you? Because of what society remembers?" The directness of the question stole Victoria's breath. No one had dared speak so plainly to her about her past in years. They either pretended to forget or whispered behind closed doors. "You're very forward, Mr. Pembroke," she said, fighting to maintain her composure. "Henry," he corrected gently. "And yes, another American failing, but you haven't answered my question." Victoria moved toward a particularly vibrant crimson rose, touching its petals as she gathered her thoughts. "What society remembers of me is largely true, if incomplete. I made a disastrous marriage that ended in scandal and near ruin. I've spent 4 years rebuilding a life of modest dignity and independence. I maintain distance because it's safer that way." "Safer," he repeated, moving to stand beside her. "But is it living, Victoria?" The use of her given name should have offended her. Instead, it sent a strange thrill through her veins. "It's survival," she replied honestly, "which is more than many women in my position manage to achieve." Henry was silent for a moment, studying her with that penetrating gaze that seemed to see beneath her carefully composed exterior. "May I tell you what I see when I look at you?" Victoria's instinct was to refuse, to retreat behind propriety's shield. But something in his expression, earnest, almost vulnerable despite his confidence, made her nod. "I see a woman of remarkable strength who has confused safety with happiness. Who has built walls so high she's forgotten there was once a door. He spoke softly, without judgment. I understand that, Victoria. I've built my share of walls as well. You can't possibly understand, she said, though without heat. Your circumstances are entirely different. The specifics, yes, but the impulse to protect oneself by retreating. That I understand perfectly. He reached out slowly, as if to touch her arm, then stopped himself. When I left England, I was running from expectations I couldn't meet, from a path I didn't choose. I built a life across an ocean, rather than face my father's disappointment. Victoria frowned. That hardly seems comparable to having your heart broken, to having your trust betrayed, to building a fortress around yourself to ensure it never happens again. His gaze held hers. I may not know the particulars of your story, Victoria, but I recognize its shape. The words struck too close to truth. Victoria felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. Why are you saying these things to me? We barely know each other. Because from the moment I saw you across that ballroom, I recognized something in you that called to something in me. He spoke with simple conviction. And because life is too short to waste on the elaborate dance of pretending not to feel what we feel. Victoria took a step back, suddenly aware of how private their conversation had become, how far they had strayed from acceptable acquaintance. Mr. Pembroke. Henry, he corrected again, gently. Henry, she conceded, whatever you believe you see in me, I must warn you that I have no intention of remarrying, ever. I value my independence too highly to risk it again. Instead of the disappointment or persuasion she expected, he smiled. I haven't proposed marriage, Victoria. I've merely suggested that perhaps there's room in your carefully constructed life for something more than mere survival. He glanced toward the main gathering. We should return before Augusta's matchmaking becomes too obvious. As they walked back toward the party, Victoria felt strangely unmoored. Their conversation had veered wildly beyond the boundaries of proper acquaintance, yet she couldn't bring herself to regret it. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to her not as a cautionary tale or a social obligation, but as a woman of substance and complexity. Will you be attending the Merriweather Musicale next week? Henry asked as they neared the gathering. Victoria hesitated. I hadn't planned to. Consider it, he said simply. I find I rather enjoy conversing with someone who doesn't giggle at every third word. Despite herself, Victoria smiled. A compelling argument, to be sure. Until then, Lady Dunham, he said formally as they rejoined the party, bowing over her hand with impeccable manners that somehow conveyed private amusement rather than social deference. As he moved away to fulfill his obligations to other guests, Victoria found herself watching him with a strange mixture of wariness and anticipation. Henry Pembroke represented everything she had determined to avoid: complication, emotional risk, the dangerous territory of genuine connection. Yet as she observed him throughout the afternoon, noting the subtle difference between his public smile and the one he had shared with her among the roses, Victoria found herself wondering if her carefully constructed independence had become its own kind of prison. The Merriweather Musicale marked the beginning of what Victoria would later recognize as the gradual dismantling of her defenses. She attended, telling herself it was merely to satisfy curiosity, but the way her pulse quickened when Henry entered the room told a different story. They exchanged only brief conversation that evening, yet something had shifted. Where before she had felt invisible in society, she now felt his awareness of her presence like a tangible connection across crowded rooms. Over the following weeks, they encountered each other with increasing frequency. Sometimes these meetings seemed the product of chance, passing in Hyde Park, discovering themselves at the same exhibition at the Royal Academy. Other times the orchestration was more transparent, as when Lady Harrington seated them together at a small dinner party. Each encounter deepened Victoria's sense that Henry Pembroke was unlike anyone she had known before. He spoke to her with refreshing directness, challenging her perspectives without dismissing them, sharing his own experiences with surprising candor. "I nearly drowned off the coast of Barbados during my first year at sea," he told her one afternoon as they walked through the British Museum, having coincidentally encountered each other among the Greek antiquities. "It taught me that most of what we fear isn't worth the energy we expend avoiding it, including drowning." Victoria asked dryly. He laughed. "Point taken, but reasonable caution is different from arranging one's entire existence around fear of what might happen." He glanced at her. "Your husband hurt you badly. I understand that creates wariness." Victoria stiffened. They had never directly discussed Thomas before. "You know nothing about my marriage. I know it left scars deep enough that you've forsworn the possibility of happiness with anyone else," he said quietly. "That speaks volumes." Victoria stopped walking, turning to face a marble statue to hide the emotion his words had triggered. "It wasn't simply that he hurt me," she said after a moment. "It was that I was foolish enough to believe in him completely. I gave him everything, my trust, my reputation, my fortune, because I believed in love as some grand, transformative force." She shook her head. "I was naive." Henry moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, but not so close as to draw attention. "Or perhaps you simply loved unwisely, not wrongly." Victoria glanced up, surprised by the distinction. "Is there a difference?" "I believe so." His expression was thoughtful. "Loving unwisely means choosing the wrong person or the wrong time. Loving wrongly would mean the act itself was mistaken." He met her gaze. "I don't believe love itself is ever wrong, Victoria. Only our choices about where we place it." The words resonated in ways Victoria found unsettling. She had spent years convincing herself that love itself was the mistake, that wanting connection, passion, understanding was a weakness she could not afford. Henry's perspective challenged the very foundation of her carefully constructed worldview. Before she could formulate a response, a voice called out from across the gallery. "Henry." What a delightful surprise. They turned to find a fashionably dressed woman approaching, her smile warm but her eyes calculating as they flicked between Henry and Victoria. "Lady Caroline," Henry acknowledged with a polite bow. "May I present Lady Victoria Dunham? Victoria, Lady Caroline Wexford is an old family friend." Lady Caroline's smile tightened almost imperceptibly as she curtsied. "Lady Dunham, how unexpected to find you here." Her emphasis suggested she found more than Victoria's presence at the museum surprising. "Lady Wexford," Victoria returned evenly, recognizing the subtle judgment in the other woman's tone. Lady Caroline had been among the most vocal critics of Victoria's marriage years ago. Her presence now felt like an intrusion from a past Victoria had worked hard to leave behind. "Henry, you must tell me if you'll be attending the Winthrop Ball next week," Lady Caroline continued, effectively dismissing Victoria from the conversation. "The Dowager Duchess specifically asked me to ensure your attendance." Victoria took a step back, the familiar sensation of social exclusion settling over her like a well-worn cloak. "If you'll excuse me, I should continue my tour of the exhibits. It was a pleasure, Lady Wexford." She moved away before either could respond, walking with measured steps until she rounded a corner into the next gallery. Only then did she allow her shoulders to sag slightly. The encounter had been a stark reminder of her precarious position and of the folly of allowing herself to grow attached to a man of Henry Pembroke's standing. She was studying a collection of Roman artifacts with determined focus when footsteps approached behind her. "That was badly done of her," Henry said without preamble. Victoria didn't turn. Lady Caroline merely acknowledged the reality of our respective positions in society, Mr. Pembroke. "We're back to Mr. Pembroke, are we?" There was gentle reproach in his voice. "Caroline Wexford is a snob whose opinion matters to exactly no one whose opinion is worth having." Now Victoria did turn, her composure firmly in place. Her opinion represents that of your social circle, Henry. The sooner we both acknowledge that, the better. Henry's expression darkened. My social circle, as you put it, holds no more sway over my choices now than it did when I left England a decade ago. Perhaps not, Victoria conceded, but they hold considerable sway over mine. I have built a precarious peace with society, Henry. I cannot afford to become the subject of fresh speculation. And is that what I represent to you, a risk to your social standing? There was hurt beneath his challenge, and it pierced Victoria more deeply than she had expected. You represent, she faltered, searching for words that would neither mislead nor reveal too much. You represent complications I never anticipated, possibilities I had determined to avoid. Something in Henry's expression softened. Victoria, he said quietly, I have no wish to disrupt the life you've built, but I find myself increasingly unwilling to pretend that what exists between us is merely friendship. Victoria felt her heart skip at the frank admission. What exists between us is dangerous, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, for both of us, but especially for me. Only if we allow fear to dictate our choices. He took a step closer. I'm not Thomas Dunham, Victoria. I don't make promises lightly, and I don't break them once made. You don't understand, Victoria said, fighting the urge to retreat. It isn't simply about trust or promises. It's about what I would have to sacrifice. She met his gaze directly. I fought hard for my independence, Henry. I won't surrender it again, not even for... She stopped herself before completing the thought. Not even for love, he finished quietly. The word hung between them, too significant to dismiss, too frightening to acknowledge fully. I should go, Victoria said, her composure threatening to crack. This conversation has strayed far beyond the boundaries of propriety. Henry didn't try to stop her as she moved past him, but his voice followed her. The Winthrop Ball, he said. Will you be there? Victoria paused without turning back. I don't think that would be wise. Probably not, he agreed, and she could hear the smile in his voice. But wisdom seems a poor substitute for living, don't you think? Victoria left without answering, her thoughts in turmoil. As her carriage carried her home, she found herself confronting truths she had carefully avoided. Over these weeks of unexpected encounters and startlingly honest conversations, Henry Pembrooke had somehow breached the walls she had built around her heart. More dangerous still, he had made her question whether those walls were protecting her or imprisoning her. The invitation to the Winthrop Ball sat on Victoria's writing desk for 3 days before she acknowledged the decision she had already made. She would attend, not because Henry would be there, or at least not entirely because of that, but because for the first time in years she found herself wanting to participate in life rather than merely observing it from a safe distance. The night of the ball arrived with unseasonable warmth that left London streets humid and close. Victoria chose a gown of pale green silk, more vibrant than her usual subdued palette. Agnes noticed the change immediately. This suits you beautifully, miss, she said as she arranged Victoria's hair. It brings out the color in your cheeks. Victoria studied her reflection with critical eyes. At 26, she was still young, though she had grown accustomed to thinking of herself as firmly on the shelf. Tonight she saw something different in the mirror, a woman not merely surviving, but perhaps, finally, beginning to live again. The Winthrop estate blazed with light as Victoria's carriage joined the queue. Unlike her careful, unobtrusive arrivals at previous events, tonight she felt a flutter of anticipation as the footman helped her descend. The ballroom was already crowded when she entered. Victoria scanned the room with deliberate casualness, telling herself she wasn't searching for one particular face among the hundreds present. She had just accepted a glass of champagne when Lady Harrington appeared at her elbow. "You've caused quite a stir, my dear," the older woman said without preamble. Victoria frowned. "I've only just arrived." "Not tonight," Lady Harrington clarified with a knowing smile. Your recent appearances with Henry Pembroke have set tongues wagging. Caroline Wexford is positively apoplectic. Victoria felt a chill of alarm. We've merely encountered each other at various events. There's nothing improper. Of course not, Lady Harrington interrupted, patting her arm. But society doesn't require impropriety for speculation, merely interest. Her expression grew more serious. I should warn you that Caroline has been particularly vocal about her concerns to the Dowager Duchess of Westmoreland, Henry's grandmother. Victoria's alarm deepened. What concerns could she possibly have to express? That a widow of questionable reputation is setting her cap for the newly returned heir, of course. Lady Harrington's tone made it clear what she thought of such accusations. Caroline had hopes in that direction herself before Henry left England. She seems determined to revive them now that he's returned. Before Victoria could respond, a murmur passed through the crowd near the entrance. She turned to see Henry entering the ballroom, resplendent in formal evening attire. Unlike previous events where he had maintained an air of slight detachment, tonight he moved with purpose, his gaze scanning the room until it found her. The moment their eyes met, Victoria felt that now familiar jolt of connection. Henry's expression brightened visibly, and he began moving toward her with the directness that was so distinctively his. "Ah," Lady Harrington murmured with satisfaction, "right on cue." But before Henry could reach them, he was intercepted by an elderly woman leaning on the arm of a distinguished gentleman. Though small in stature, the woman carried herself with unmistakable authority. The Dowager Duchess of Westmoreland, Victoria realized, with Henry's brother, the Duke, beside her. Victoria watched as Henry bent to kiss his grandmother's cheek. The old woman said something that made Henry's posture stiffen slightly. His gaze flicked toward Victoria, then back to his grandmother with a frown. "Oh dear," Lady Harrington sighed. "It appears Caroline has been busy indeed." Victoria set down her champagne glass with a steady hand. "I think perhaps I should step outside for a moment," she said quietly. "The heat is rather oppressive." Lady Harrington gave her a shrewd look. "Running away, my dear, that doesn't seem like you." "Not running," Victoria corrected, "simply avoiding a scene that would benefit no one." She made her way toward the terrace doors with unhurried grace, ignoring the speculative glances that followed her. The night air was a welcome relief after the stuffiness of the ballroom. Victoria moved to the stone balustrade, gazing out over the moonlit garden and taking slow, deliberate breaths. She had been foolish to come tonight, foolish to imagine that her growing attachment to Henry Pembroke could lead anywhere but disappointment. Their worlds were too different, the shadows of her past too dark. "Victoria." She didn't need to turn to recognize Henry's voice. "You shouldn't be out here with me," she said quietly. "It will only fuel the gossip." "Let it," he said, moving to stand beside her. "I've never particularly cared for the opinion of gossips." Victoria turned to face him, her expression grave. "Your grandmother might feel differently." Henry's mouth tightened. "You've heard, then." "Lady Harrington mentioned that Lady Caroline has been expressing concerns about my influence on you." Victoria kept her voice even despite the humiliation burning in her chest. "It's hardly surprising. I should have anticipated it." "It's ridiculous," Henry said with unexpected heat. "My grandmother has no right to dictate my friendships based on malicious gossip." "Doesn't she?" Victoria asked. "You're the heir to a dukedom, Henry. Your associations reflect on your family." "I ceased concerning myself with such reflections the day I boarded a merchant vessel bound for Boston." His expression softened as he studied her face. "Why did you come tonight, Victoria?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. Victoria considered deflecting, offering some socially acceptable explanation, but found herself unwilling to retreat into polite fiction. "Because you asked me to," she admitted simply. "Because for the first time in years, I wanted to accept an invitation not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire. Something kindled in Henry's eyes at her words. "And what is it you desire, Victoria?" The question hung between them, laden with meaning beyond its simple words. Victoria felt her carefully constructed defenses wavering. "I don't know anymore," she confessed, her voice barely audible above the distant music from the ballroom. "For years, all I wanted was safety, independence, control over my own life." She met his gaze directly. "But these past weeks with you have reminded me of things I thought I'd surrendered forever." "What things?" Henry asked, stepping closer. "Connection, laughter." Victoria hesitated, then added with painful honesty, "the possibility of more than mere existence." Henry's hand rose as if to touch her face, then dropped back to his side, mindful of their public setting. "Victoria," he said, her name almost a caress, "I have crossed oceans and continents, built fortunes and lost them, known beauty in a dozen distant lands. But I have never encountered anyone who affects me as you do." The raw emotion in his voice stole Victoria's breath. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what might be possible between them. Not the safe, constrained existence she had carved out for herself, but something vital and real. Then reality reasserted itself as voices drifted toward them from the ballroom. They were seen going to the terrace, a woman's voice said with poorly disguised eagerness. "Alone." Victoria stepped back, the spell broken. "This is precisely what I feared," she said quietly. "Henry, we cannot continue this. Whatever this is, your position, my past, they make any connection between us impossible." "I refuse to accept that," Henry said, his voice low but intense. "I didn't travel halfway around the world and build a life from nothing only to surrender happiness because society deems it inappropriate." "It's not just society," Victoria insisted. "It's practical reality. I won't be the cause of a rift between you and your family, and I won't risk my independence, not even for—" She stopped herself, unwilling to name the emotion growing between them. "For love," Henry finished, as he had once before at the museum, but this time there was certainty in his voice. "Because that's what this is becoming, Victoria. At least have the courage to acknowledge it." Victoria felt tears threatening and blinked them back fiercely. "Love is a luxury I cannot afford, Henry. Not again." The ballroom doors opened fully, spilling light and music onto the terrace. Victoria saw Lady Caroline standing in the doorway, triumph in her expression as she took in the scene before her. "Oh my," she said with exaggerated concern. "How very private. I do hope I'm not interrupting." Henry turned, positioning himself slightly in front of Victoria as if to shield her. "You are, in fact, interrupting Caroline. A private conversation between friends." "Friends," Lady Caroline repeated with a knowing smile. "How delightful. The Dowager Duchess was concerned when you disappeared so suddenly after your conversation. I offered to find you." She glanced meaningfully at Victoria. "And so I have." Victoria straightened her shoulders, her social mask firmly in place, despite the turmoil within. "Mr. Pembroke was kind enough to escort me for some fresh air. The ballroom was rather warm." She moved past both of them toward the doors. "If you'll excuse me, I believe I should find my carriage." "Victoria, wait," Henry said, reaching for her arm. She paused, not looking back. "Good evening, Mr. Pembroke, Lady Caroline." With that, she walked back into the ballroom, her posture perfect, her pace unhurried despite the desire to flee. She collected her shawl and reticule, made her polite goodbyes to her hosts, and departed with the dignity she had cultivated over years of navigating scandal's aftermath. Only when her carriage was well away from Winthrop House did Victoria allow herself to acknowledge the pain spreading through her chest. It felt remarkably like grief, not for something lost, but for something that could never be. The following days passed in a fog of melancholy that Victoria refused to indulge. She had survived far worse, after all. A few weeks of unprecedented connection, of feeling truly seen and understood, could not undo the hard-won lessons of her past. Yet the carefully ordered routines of her life, once a source of comfort, now felt hollow. The quiet of her small household, once peaceful, now echoed with absence. The independence she had fought so hard to secure seemed suddenly more like isolation. A week after the Winthrop ball, Victoria sat in her drawing room reviewing correspondence when Agnes entered with a small package. "Delivered by messenger, miss," Agnes said, placing it on the table beside her. The package contained a book bound in soft leather. No note accompanied it, but when Victoria opened the volume, she found it was a collection of poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. A ribbon marked one page, and Victoria found her eyes drawn to the sonnet highlighted there. "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach when feeling out of sight. For the ends of being and ideal grace." The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. Victoria closed the book carefully, her hands trembling. The message was clear enough, even without a signature or note. Henry was declaring himself in the only way propriety allowed, through words not his own, but which spoke his heart nonetheless. "Agnes," Victoria said, her voice steadier than she felt, "please bring me my writing case." She pennied a brief note, her quill hesitating several times as she searched for words that would neither encourage nor wound. "Mr. Pembroke, while I am moved by the sentiment, I must return this volume. What it represents cannot exist between us without consequences neither of us should invite. With sincere regard. V. Dunham." She wrapped the book carefully and summoned a messenger to return it. As she watched him depart, Victoria felt as though she were severing something vital, a possibility too precious and too dangerous to contemplate. The following morning, the book reappeared on her doorstep, this time with a note in a bold, masculine hand. "Victoria. Some things, once acknowledged, cannot be returned or forgotten. I respect your concerns, but I cannot pretend indifference when none exists. I will be at the Chelsea Physic Garden tomorrow at noon. If you do not come, I will understand and will trouble you no further. But know that my regard for you remains unchanged, regardless of your decision. Yours, Henry." Victoria read the note 3 times, her resolve weakening with each reading. The directness of it, so characteristic of Henry, struck at the heart of her carefully constructed defenses. He was offering her a choice, clear, uncomplicated, honest. She spent a restless night weighing that choice against everything she had built over the past 4 years. By morning, she had reached no conclusion. As noon approached the following day, Victoria found herself dressing with particular care in a walking dress of deep blue. She told herself she had not decided to meet him, that she was merely keeping her options open should she choose to take the air. At 11:30, she called for her carriage. The Chelsea Physic Garden was relatively quiet on a weekday, its orderly beds of medicinal plants and exotic specimens offering a peaceful retreat from London's bustle. Victoria walked along the gravel paths, her parasol shielding her from the summer sun, her heart beating traitorously fast. She found Henry near the pond at the garden's centre. He stood with his back to her, gazing into the water, his posture betraying tension despite his casual stance. Something in the sight of him, waiting, uncertain, vulnerable despite his strength, touched Victoria deeply. "The water lilies are particularly fine this year," she said quietly as she approached. Henry turned, his expression transforming from anxious anticipation to undisguised joy. "You came," he said simply. "I'm not certain I should have," Victoria admitted, joining him at the pond's edge. "But I found I couldn't stay away." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the play of sunlight on water. Victoria felt strangely peaceful despite the significance of the moment, as though whatever came next, she had already crossed some invisible threshold. "I spoke with my grandmother yesterday," Henry said finally. A long, overdue conversation about expectations and choices. Victoria tensed. Henry, you needn't have. I did, he interrupted gently. Not for your sake, though you were certainly part of it, but for my own. 10 years ago, I fled rather than stand my ground. I won't make that mistake again. What did she say? Victoria asked, unable to quell her curiosity. Henry smiled slightly. She reminded me that Pembrooks have never been known for conventional choices. My grandfather married her despite her father's bankruptcy. My uncle wed an opera singer, and my cousin eloped with his riding instructor, a man, as it happens. Victoria stared at him in surprise. I had no idea. Few do. The family is remarkably adept at managing scandal when it suits them. He turned to face her fully. My point is that whatever objections society might raise to our association, my family has weathered far worse. That may be true for your family, Victoria said carefully. But mine has no such resources. My scandal is not forgotten, merely overlooked so long as I maintain certain boundaries. And is that enough for you, Henry asked, to be overlooked? To exist at the margins of a society whose judgment you know to be capricious and often cruel? The question struck at the heart of the comfortable fiction Victoria had created for herself. She had told herself that invisibility was a choice, a strategy for survival, but had it become a prison of her own making? I don't know what else is possible, she admitted. I've spent years convincing myself that independence and safety are sufficient for happiness. And are they? Henry's gaze was gentle but unflinching. Victoria looked away, unable to sustain the weight of his regard. They were, she said softly, until you. The simple admission hung between them, more revealing than any declaration. Henry moved closer, still maintaining a respectable distance, but near enough that Victoria could sense the warmth of him. Victoria, he said, her name almost a prayer on his lips, I have no wish to threaten your independence. What I offer isn't a cage, but a partnership. Not safety, perhaps, but something worth the risk. And what is that? She asked, though she already knew the answer. A chance to live fully again, Henry said. To be seen, not as society defines you, but as you truly are. To build something together that neither of us could create alone. He smiled, the expression both tender and determined. And yes, love, unashamed, undisguised, ungoverned by fear. Victoria felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sorrow but from the painful beauty of possibility. I'm afraid, she confessed, not of you but of myself. Of wanting too much, of believing too completely. As am I, Henry admitted, surprising her. I've spent a decade avoiding attachments, protecting myself from precisely this vulnerability. He reached for her hand, the touch sending a current of warmth through her, even through their gloves. But I've learned that a life without risk is hardly a life at all. Victoria looked down at their joined hands, then back to his face. In his expression, she saw everything she had denied herself: passion, connection, the exhilarating uncertainty of genuine emotion. I can't promise it will be easy, she said finally. Society has a long memory, and your position makes discretion difficult. Henry's smile widened. I've never had much talent for discretion, I'm afraid. But I excel at persistence. His thumb traced a gentle circle on her palm. Will you allow me to court you properly, Victoria? Not in shadows or secrecy, but openly, with the respect you deserve. The question represented everything she had thought beyond her reach, not merely romance, but dignity. The chance to be valued not despite her past, but inclusive of it. To be chosen, not as a forbidden indulgence, but as a woman worthy of honor. Yes, she said, the word emerging as barely more than a whisper, though heaven knows where it may lead. To happiness, I hope, Henry said, lifting her hand to his lips in a gesture that, while entirely proper, sent a thrill through her veins. The rest we'll discover together. As they walked through the garden, maintaining proper distance, but connected by something far more profound than physical proximity, Victoria felt as though a weight she had carried for years had begun to lift. Whatever came next, society's judgment, family concerns, the inevitable complications of two strong-willed people finding their way together. She would face it not from behind protective walls, but standing in the clear light of possibility. For the first time since her world had collapsed around her 4 years ago, Victoria allowed herself to hope for more than mere survival, for joy, for passion, for a love born not of naive illusion, but of clear-eyed choice. The weeks that followed marked a transformation in Victoria's life, as profound as any she had experienced. Henry courted her with a blend of old-world gallantry and refreshing directness that left her both breathless and strangely grounded. He sent books rather than flowers, each containing passages marked that spoke to their growing understanding of each other. He escorted her to exhibitions and concerts, his hand warm at her back, his conversation challenging her to express opinions she had long kept private. He introduced her to his family, first his brother, whose initial reserve melted into cautious approval, then his formidable grandmother, who assessed Victoria with keen eyes before pronouncing her a woman of substance at last. Society reacted much as Victoria had expected, with raised eyebrows and whispered speculations. Lady Caroline made her disapproval known through pointed remarks and public snubs. But where once such reactions would have devastated Victoria, now she found them curiously powerless to wound her. "You seem different," Elena remarked one afternoon as they took tea in Victoria's drawing room. "Happier, certainly, but something else too, more present." Victoria considered this assessment as she stirred her tea. "I suppose I am," she agreed. "For years, I've been holding my breath, waiting for the next disaster. I've only recently realized how exhausting that was." Elena's expression grew serious. "People are talking, you know, about you and Mr. Pembroke." "I know," Victoria said calmly. "Let them talk. Most have been discussing me behind my back for years. At least now they have something new to say." Elena laughed, surprised by her cousin's uncharacteristic defiance. "Well, I think it's wonderful, Mr. Pembroke looks at you, as though you've hung the moon and stars." Victoria felt warmth rise to her cheeks. "He's a remarkable man," she said simply, unwilling to articulate the depth of her feelings even to her cousin. But those feelings grew with each passing day, blossoming in the fertile ground of mutual respect and understanding. With Henry, Victoria found herself laughing more freely, speaking more honestly, dreaming more boldly than she had in years. He challenged her assumptions without dismissing her concerns, valued her independence while offering steadfast support. And when, 6 weeks after their meeting in the Chelsea Physic Garden, Henry asked her to accompany him to the Pembroke summer ball, Victoria understood the significance of the invitation. The annual event at his family's ancestral home would mark her formal introduction to society as the woman in Henry Pembroke's life, not as a scandalous widow, not as a cautionary tale, but as a woman chosen and valued by one of England's most eligible men. "Are you certain?" she asked, studying his face for any trace of doubt. "Your family's ball is rather different from a musicale or exhibition. It's a statement." Henry's smile held both certainty and a trace of mischief. "A statement I'm eager to make," he assured her. "Unless you'd prefer to keep me dangling in suspense a while longer." Victoria laughed, the sound free and genuine. "As if your ego required further inflation," she teased, then sobered slightly. "You understand that some will never approve, regardless of your family's acceptance." "Their approval is neither required nor desired," Henry said, taking her hand. "The only person whose opinion concerns me is the remarkable woman before me, who has shown me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the determination to move forward despite it." Victoria felt her heart expand with emotion too complex for simple naming. Not merely love, though that was certainly part of it, but a profound gratitude for this unexpected chance to begin again, not by erasing her past, but by incorporating it into a future brighter than she had dared imagine. "Then yes," she said, "I would be honored to accompany you to the Pembroke ball." The night of the ball arrived with perfect late summer weather, the air warm but not oppressive, the sky clear and star-filled. Victoria dressed with care in a gown of deep crimson silk, more vibrant and daring than anything she had worn since her marriage. "You look like a queen, miss," Agnes declared as she fastened Victoria's mother's pearls around her neck. "That Mr. Pembroke won't know what's hit him." Victoria smiled at her reflection, hardly recognizing the woman who gazed back, not because of the elegant gown or carefully arranged hair, but because of the light in her eyes, the color in her cheeks, the subtle but unmistakable aura of a woman who had rediscovered joy. Henry's carriage arrived precisely on time, with Henry himself descending to escort her rather than sending a footman. When she appeared in the doorway, he stood motionless for a moment, his expression one of undisguised admiration. "Victoria," he said, the word conveying volumes of feeling. "You take my breath away." She felt herself blush like a girl receiving her first compliment. "You're very handsome yourself," she replied, noting how his formal attire emphasized his broad shoulders and trim waist. The journey to Pembroke House passed in companionable conversation, though Victoria felt a growing nervousness as they approached. This would be her first time seeing the house that had witnessed their initial encounter, the moment when his gaze had found hers across a crowded ballroom and something inexplicable had passed between them. The mansion was even more impressive by night, its facade illuminated by countless lanterns, its grounds transformed into a fairy tale landscape of light and shadow. Carriages lined the circular drive, disgorging elegantly dressed guests who ascended the marble steps with excited anticipation. As their carriage joined the queue, Henry took Victoria's hand. "Nervous?" he asked gently. "A little," she admitted. "It's been some time since I attended an event of this magnitude without the protection of insignificance." Henry's expression sobered. "You have never been insignificant, Victoria. Not to anyone who truly sees you." The simple declaration steadied her. By the time their carriage reached the entrance, Victoria had composed herself, ready to face whatever the evening might bring. They ascended the steps together, Henry's hand at her back, providing quiet reassurance. The majordomo announced them at the entrance to the ballroom, and Victoria felt the ripple of awareness pass through the crowd as heads turned to observe their arrival. Lady Victoria Dunham, accompanied by Mr. Henry Pembroke. For a moment, Victoria was transporting back to her first entrance into this same room months earlier, alone, invisible, expecting nothing. The contrast between then and now was so profound that she felt momentarily disoriented. "All right," Henry murmured, his voice close to her ear. Victoria nodded, squaring her shoulders. "Yes," she said with quiet conviction. "More than all right." They moved into the ballroom together, and Victoria was conscious of the speculative glances, the whispered comments behind fans, the varying expressions of surprise, disapproval, and in some cases, genuine pleasure at seeing them together. Lady Harrington, resplendent in purple satin, caught Victoria's eye from across the room and raised her glass in silent toast. Henry led Victoria through the crowd with easy confidence, introducing her to those she hadn't yet met, his hand never leaving the small of her back. Each introduction, each conversation, each small gesture of public acknowledgement reinforced the message. Victoria was not merely permitted in this world, but welcomed as his chosen companion. When the orchestra began the opening strains of a waltz, Henry turned to her with a formal bow. "Would you do me the honor, Lady Dunham?" Victoria placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her to the center of the floor. As other couples joined them, she was acutely aware of their position, not on the margins, not hidden in the crowd, but visible to all. "Everyone is watching," she murmured as Henry's hand settled at her waist. "Let them," he replied, his gaze fixed on her face as they began to move with the music. "They're witnessing something worth seeing, a woman of extraordinary courage embracing life without apology." Victoria felt herself flush at his words, but didn't look away. As they moved together in perfect synchronization, she realized how far she had come from that cautious, wounded woman who had entered this same ballroom months ago, determined to remain invisible. "I never expected this," she admitted softly. "What?" Henry asked, drawing her a fraction closer than strict propriety allowed. "Any of it," Victoria said. "You, this feeling, the possibility of beginning again." Henry's expression softened. "When I returned to England, I expected to fulfill my obligations to my family, perhaps establish a business, and eventually retreat to a comfortable bachelor existence. I had no intention of losing my heart to a woman who challenged every assumption I'd ever made about what matters in life." Victoria felt her breath catch at the frank declaration. They had spoken of feelings, of connection, of possibilities, but never so directly of love. "And have you," she asked, her voice barely audible above the music, "lost your heart?" Henry's gaze held hers, unwavering and certain. "Completely and irrevocably," he said. "From the moment my eyes found yours across this very room, something in me recognized something in you. The rest has simply been the process of discovering what I think I already knew." Victoria felt tears threatening and blinked them back, unwilling to create a spectacle. "Henry," she began, but found words inadequate to express the tumult of emotion his declaration had provoked. "You don't need to say anything," he assured her, guiding her through a turn. "I don't speak to extract promises or declarations, only to ensure that you know, without doubt or reservation, exactly what you mean to me." As the waltz concluded, Henry led Victoria from the dance floor toward the terrace doors. The night air was cool and sweet, with the scent of late summer blooms. Stars glittered overhead, and the distant sound of the orchestra created a dreamlike backdrop to the moment. They stood side by side at the stone balustrade, gazing out over the moonlit garden. Victoria felt a profound sense of completion, as though a circle begun months ago on this very terrace was now closing. "The first time we spoke," she said quietly, "I told you that I would never remarry, that I valued my independence too highly to risk it." Henry nodded, his expression solemn. "I remember. I still value my independence," Victoria continued, choosing her words with care. "But I've come to understand that there's a difference between independence and isolation, between protecting oneself and imprisoning oneself." She turned to face him fully, gathering her courage for what she needed to say. "You've shown me that it's possible to be both connected and free. That love, real love, doesn't require surrender of self, but expansion of it." Henry's eyes never left her face, his gaze intent as though memorizing every word, every nuance of her expression. "What I'm trying to say," Victoria continued, her voice steady despite the emotion filling her chest, "is that I love you, Henry Pembroke. Not because you've rescued me or completed me, but because you've helped me remember who I truly am and shown me who I might become." The declaration hung between them, honest and vulnerable, and more powerful for its simplicity. Henry reached for her hands, holding them between his own. "Victoria," he said, her name a caress on his lips, "from the moment I returned to England, I've been searching for something I couldn't name, a purpose, a belonging, a future that felt true. I found it the instant I saw you." He lifted one hand to touch her cheek gently. "I love you, your strength, your caution, your fierce independence, your capacity for joy despite everything you've endured. I love the woman you are and the woman you're becoming." Victoria leaned into his touch, allowing herself to accept the gift of his words without doubt or reservation. In this moment, the past with its painful lessons seemed not forgotten, but transformed, stepping stones that had led her here, to this man, to this realization of possibilities she had thought forever lost. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted with a small smile. "I've spent so long avoiding the future that I'm not entirely sure how to embrace it." Henry's answering smile held both tenderness and certainty. "What happens next is entirely up to us," he said. but I hope it involves a lifetime of conversations, challenges, discoveries, and moments like this one, where we stand together, facing whatever comes with courage and honesty, and yes, love." He released her hands and reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. Victoria's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a ring of unusual design, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds in an intricate gold setting. "This belonged to my grandmother," Henry said quietly. "Not the Dowager Duchess, but my mother's mother, who was a ship captain's daughter from Boston, a woman who crossed an ocean for love and never regretted it." He met Victoria's gaze directly. "I'm not asking you to cross an ocean, Victoria, only to take a step forward with me into a future we'll build together." He didn't kneel, another American impropriety that seemed perfectly right in this moment. Instead, he held the ring between them, an offering rather than a claim. "Victoria Dunham, will you marry me? Not as a surrender of your independence, but as a partnership of equals. Not as an escape from the past, but as a choice for the future." Victoria looked at the ring, then at the man holding it, this extraordinary man who had breached her defenses not by storming them, but by showing her they were no longer necessary, who had taught her that safety wasn't found in isolation, but in the courage to be vulnerable, who had helped her remember that her heart, though once broken, remained capable of extraordinary love. "Yes," she said, the word emerging clear and certain. "Yes, I will marry you, Henry Pembroke." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, its weight unfamiliar yet somehow right, Victoria felt the last of her carefully constructed walls dissolve. Not in surrender, but in transformation, from protection to connection, from caution to courage, from mere survival to the promise of abundant life. Henry drew her into his arms, mindful even now of their visible position on the terrace. His kiss was gentle, proper enough for public view, yet conveying a depth of feeling that left Victoria breathless. When they parted, she saw in his eyes the same wonder she felt, that out of scandal and loss, across oceans and years, against all probability and prudence, they had found each other. That in a ballroom filled with strangers, his gaze had found hers, and in that moment everything had changed. Together, they turned back toward the ballroom, where music and light and the future awaited them. Not a future without challenges or judgments or difficulties, but one they would face together, with clear eyes and open hearts. And as they re-entered the ballroom, Victoria noticed something remarkable. The whispers that had followed her for years, the sidelong glances, the careful distance maintained by polite society, they seemed to fall away before the certainty of the love she and Henry had found. Not everyone approved. Lady Caroline's pinched expression made that clear enough, but Victoria discovered that approval mattered far less than she had once believed. What mattered was the man beside her, his hand warm and steady in hers. What mattered was the truth they had discovered together, that love, when founded on honesty and respect, could indeed transform not just circumstances, but hearts. That the past, with all its pain and lessons, need not determine the future. That second chances, when embraced with courage, could lead to joys beyond imagining. As Henry led her to the center of the floor for another dance, Victoria caught sight of their reflection in one of the ballroom's gilt-edged mirrors, a handsome man gazing at his companion as though she were the most precious thing in creation, a woman whose eyes held not the shadow of old sorrows, but the light of new beginnings. And in that moment, surrounded by music and movement, and the whispered wonder of those who witnessed their evident happiness, Victoria understood at last what Henry had been telling her from the beginning. That life's greatest risk was not in loving too deeply or hoping too fervently, but in allowing fear to close the door on possibility. She had taken that risk, they both had. And whatever the future held, they would face it as they now moved across the ballroom floor. Together, in perfect harmony, their steps matched to the same music, their hearts beating to the same joyful rhythm of love acknowledged, accepted, and returned in full measure.